Welcome to Cache Valley Counseling's Max Group. My name is Spencer Dutson. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, certified emotionally focused couples therapist, and trained in EMDR. I'm really excited to be presenting my topic of today, which I've titled Three Pillars of Being Emotionally Attractive: Ownership, Empathy, and Curiosity. And with this, happy Valentine's Day, everyone, to who might be watching this right now or after. Um, I hope that it's a meaningful holiday for you and your loved ones. So before we get started, I need to give you my spiel, and here it is. This is not therapy, and is a group of people coping with a variety of presenting problems. Information discussed and shared in this group is intended to support the therapeutic process and increase readiness for change. If you're feeling suicidal or are having life-threatening thoughts, this group is not the place to discuss those things. Please consider calling 988, getting in touch with your therapist as soon as possible, or reaching out to a loved one to help you access additional resources and coping. We are recording this and it will be available on our YouTube channel for you to rewatch. Due to this, if you are not comfortable turning your camera on, that's okay. If you would like to change your name on your Zoom profile, you can do that as well. With all of that being said, groups are most powerful when we learn from each other and share our experiences with others. Okay, so again, my topic being the pillars of being emotionally attracted. I feel like this was an important topic, especially with like Valentine's Day just happening or being right around the corner. Um, and so I hope that I can help provide some insight into these three concepts of ownership, empathy, and curiosity, and how they can help you be more emotionally attractive. But I also hope that this will help you in the context of um, looking at like potential partners or current partners and being able to feel more confident in asking for things that you need for them to be more emotionally attractive to you. Now, just to kind of get us started, I did a quick Google search before this Max group to see what the internet says about what traits men and women find to be emotionally attractive in the other. Okay. So I cannot speak to the validity of these sources. This is just the internet. This, I think, is just interesting to kind of see like what our pop culture, if you will, says about attractiveness, specifically emotionally attractiveness. So the first resource I have is from the Good Men Project. And this website highlighted 8 traits that they say men find in women that make women more emotionally attractive. Okay, so here we go. Here are 8. Okay, being patient, having self-confidence, being a good listener, focusing on the positive, being present, being able to keep secrets, and communicating openly and honestly. Okay. Then from a separate article I found on LinkedIn, here are 8 traits that women say make a man more emotionally attractive. Some of these are like multiple ones, so they cheated a little bit, but here you go. We got touch, pheromones, and body language, humor, confidence, and being open and vulnerable, being kind and respectful, making her feel special, being there for her when she needs help or advice, sharing who you are authentically, allowing her to share who she authentically is too, and being able to express your love in a variety of ways. In other words, not just one simple way. So, when I was preparing for this topic, one of the things that I kept thinking about was how we don't necessarily think a lot about emotional attractiveness in people. It's kind of more intuitive, if that makes sense. I mean, all levels of attraction are fairly intuitive, but usually when we think of attraction, we think of physicality, right? Like, are we physically attracted to that person? Emotional attraction, again, seems to be more underneath the surface. Yet it's really important when it comes to our emotional connection with a significant other, because if we don't have that emotional attraction, the relationship will probably lack consistency, right? Physical attraction is a very important spark that gets people together, but then to have a consistent relationship that's solid, we really need that emotional connection as well. Okay. And so again, you might not think about this topic all that often, but it's something that's a big driving force in all of our relationships that we have, and especially with those romantic relationships that we have. And some of these points that I found on the internet I think point to the fact that there is some awareness of this. And again, I hope that these three concepts that I'm going to be covering today help us to better understand those concepts in the grander scheme of emotional attractiveness in our romantic relationships. If you currently are watching this and you find yourself not in a romantic relationship, I hope that you'll get maybe one of two things out of this. One, maybe you'll be able to kind of keep this in mind for future potential partners or people that you're considering to date, and what level of emotional attractiveness is there for you with that person. If you're in a phase of life where you're not really looking for a romantic relationship, I hope that you can take some of these concepts and apply them into your other non-romantic relationships, because even if we don't call it like emotional attractiveness, these principles still hold true, I think, for like emotional stability and emotional connection in general. Okay, so like for example, ownership, empathy, and curiosity can be very valuable in improving our familial relationships as well, right? Like what you have with your kids or with your siblings, cousins, even with your friends and coworkers, right? In terms of just being able to connect better and more reliably with the people around you. So, with that said, let's get into things. So, the first concept on my list here is ownership. Okay. Now, there's a wonderful book out there called Extreme Ownership: How US Navy SEALs Lead and Win. And I would tell you the authors, but they both have weird last names, and I just will probably butcher them. So I'll just give you, that's the title of the book, okay? Extreme Ownership: How US Navy SEALs Lead and Win. A lot of the book is talking about using ownership in the context of business and life, but mostly with an emphasis on business. But I find the concept of extreme ownership really, really valuable. And so just kind of using the words extreme ownership to mean taking ownership of absolutely everything, even if you don't feel like you need to take ownership for those things. Okay. So more specifically, I like to break ownership down into two main areas, if you will. The first is being able to take ownership of the things I know I did wrong. Okay. So, again, a lot of my examples here are going to be from romantic relationships, and there is applicability to other types of relationships. But with this being so close to Valentine's Day, I'm trying to focus on romantic relationships. So, bear with me here. Okay. So ownership of the things I know I did wrong, right? Let's say that you and your partner or spouse get into an argument or a fight, and you do or say things in the argument that you know, man, I should not have said that, right? Most of us as human beings have a conscience and can recognize what we did wrong. If you can't, or if your partner can't, then we need to be having a different conversation, and you should probably go to couples therapy. Just put a subtle plug in for that. But it's being able to say, yeah, I did this thing or I said this thing, and being able to acknowledge that to your partner. Okay. It's not enough to just say it to myself and say, I'm going to do better next time or whatever. It really is important to be able to express that to your significant other. The second part of ownership that I think is really key, and I kind of refer this as ownership 2.0 because it's a lot harder than that first type of ownership I just mentioned. And that is taking ownership of the things that my significant other sees I did wrong. So notice the difference there. One is I can recognize I did it wrong and I take ownership of that. And the other is I can't see that I did it wrong and I take ownership of that. Right? Now, this is really important because in the context of our romantic relationships, I'm going to do things that impact my spouse, I'm married, in a negative way that I might not recognize or really feel like I messed up, you know? Like I might have said something and she might have had a reaction to it. And in my heart, I'm saying she's just being overly sensitive to this. But when my wife comes to me and she says, hey, when you said this thing to me, or when you did this thing, that really hurt me, that's where ownership 2.0 comes into play, where I can look at her and say, oh my gosh, you're right. I can totally see how that would hurt you. And I take ownership of that. I recognize now that what I did there was not okay. And I'm going to do everything I can to make up for it. That's what ownership 2.0, or this ownership of owning things that my significant other sees I did wrong, that's what that looks like. Okay. Ownership is so important because at our core, everyone is self-centered. Now, I don't mean that in a pessimistic way. I mean that kind of almost like in a purely biological survival kind of way, right? Like, think about when you're on an airplane and they give you that safety spiel and they say if oxygen gets depleted in the cabin, masks are going to drop down, and your first responsibility is to put that mask on yourself before helping the people next to you. That's what I'm referring to. We are self-centered, right? We want to take care of ourselves, but self-centeredness, while it's a good survival thing, can be very detrimental if it reaches into the realm of selfishness, which selfishness is like self-centeredness, but all the bad parts of it, right? Where you don't care about other people, all you care about is yourself. No willingness to look out for and help other people, right? It's just all me, 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 me. And so by taking ownership, we're fighting self-centeredness by being able to say, yeah, I recognize where I screwed up and I'm going to take responsibility for that. I'm going to take ownership of that thing. I can tell you right now, of all the couples I've seen in therapy, the couples who struggle the most are the ones where they can't take ownership. There's no responsibility for their actions or their words, and they focus so much on the other person. I've had so many conversations with couples where I'm begging them, you have to look at what you're doing wrong and take responsibility for that. And they just can't. All they can do is just blame the other person. Doesn't work in therapy, and those relationships usually don't survive. So ownership is really key to this emotional attractiveness, because when we see our spouse or partner being or taking ownership, what we see in them is a strength, right? A strength of, oh, they can admit they're wrong. And that's really emotionally attractive. Okay. So that's ownership. Next concept is empathy. Now, empathy, I think, is a concept that a lot of us have heard about before, but in practice, we get confused on like what that actually looks like. So I'll do my best to explain where empathy comes from and what it looks like. So the first thing I want to cover with empathy is that empathy is made possible through something in our brain and in our body called mirror neurons. Okay. So mirrors, like what you see in your bathroom, right, when you look at your reflection, do just that. They are designed to reflect emotions back to the people or person we're interacting with. Okay. So if my wife comes up to me and she says, I've had a hard day, in my brain and in my body, mirror neurons are firing to reflect back to her that I get that feeling. It allows me to kind of feel it in a way, right? Not get lost in it, not get like lost in that feeling so that I can't be present with my person, but allows me to feel it so I can reflect it back to them. Because when your partner or spouse can feel that empathy, feel that you get it, feel that you're feeling with them, it helps to calm their nervous system. There's been a ton of research on this and shows that when we are empathetic, the nervous system just calms right down. Think about a kid, right, who's just fallen and scraped their knee. If you go to them and you say, hey, suck it up, just pick yourself up, they're probably still going to like whimper and cry and maybe even be hypersensitive the next time it happens. But if you're able to meet them where they're at, be empathetic to them, feel with them, say, hey, I get that. That feels hard, right? Like you're hurting right now. Can you tell me about what you're feeling? And focus on that connection first. Kids get over it faster and they become more resilient with time, which I know seems maybe counterintuitive, especially to like this old school way of parenting, but that's what works time in and time out. So empathy is possible through mirror neurons. Next, empathy is the ability to feel with someone. In other words, it's stepping in their shoes. Okay. This is different from sympathy. Okay. Which sympathy is seeing that it could hurt or seeing that, like, oh man, what you went through is hard. It's more of a logical thing, right? Sympathy is more like a analytical thing, almost even, right? Of like, yeah, I can get why you'd go through that, right? And empathy is taking it that next step where empathy is feeling that hurt with them. Okay. Allowing yourself to kind of get in that hole with them and say, like, oh, wow, like this does feel awful to be in this place. Okay. Now, when I often express this to people in my office, they'll be like, well, Spencer, that doesn't sound healthy for me to like get sucked into their feelings, right? And that's true. The thing I like to emphasize is that empathy needs to be anchored in our own strength so as to not be overwhelmed by others. In other words, I'm grounded too. So you'll know that you're not really being empathetic if you're feeling with your partner or spouse, and all of a sudden it gets switched onto you, and now you are the one who needs the help, right? So if my wife comes to me crying, and then all of a sudden I'm the one crying, and I'm saying, I don't know how to handle this either, and I'm lost and I'm stuck, that's not empathy. That's synergy, right? That's where we're like kind of amplifying each other's feelings in a negative way. Empathy is about you staying grounded enough to be able to meet them and help them so that their nervous system can calm down and that they can feel better. Okay. So again, that's what empathy looks like. And empathy is really emotionally attractive to most of us because we all want that, right? We all want to feel connected to the people around us. It doesn't feel good for us to come to a person and say, hey, I'm struggling with this thing. And then to just say, well, have you tried this? Almost like we're just stupid or something. Like, did you try just doing that? Because that'll probably fix your problem. And it's like talking to a computer, right? Talking to some AI system and not talking to an actual human being who can look at you and say, that sucks. I'm so sorry you went through that right now. And I can kind of feel a little bit of that with you. Then we can step into fix it mode. Then we can step into, hey, how can I help you through this, right? And again, this is how our bodies work. This isn't just fluff that I'm throwing out there. This is what the science says helps us to calm our nervous systems down and resolve things quicker. So that's empathy. Similar to what I said about ownership, with the couples I work with, if they can't be empathetic to one another, in a lot of ways, the relationship is doomed from the beginning. Because if you can't feel with someone, it's not going to feel good. It's not going to feel like a lasting, connecting relationship. So empathy is really key. Let's move on to the last concept and then we'll wrap up from here. So curiosity. Curiosity is a concept that may not make a lot of sense at first when it comes to emotional attractiveness, but there's a really important reason why I included it in this list of three, and I'll explain that here in a second. So one of the best things about curiosity as it relates to relationships in general, right, romantic or otherwise, is that curiosity fights criticism. So if my spouse does something that I don't like, it's really easy to be critical of that thing that she said or did. Just almost comes natural to us, right? But if instead I'm curious about why she did what she did, what her motives were, what her feelings were that kind of drove that behavior, what thought processes she was going through, etc., then I can discover more of the why behind what she did so that then I can be empathetic to that thing, right? Which is so powerful because what could have been a reactionary fight kind of thing can become a connecting experience because the curiosity fights that criticism and natural defensiveness. Okay. Also, curiosity fighting criticism is really important because criticism, the research shows, the more you're critical with your spouse, the more contemptuous you will be. Okay. Now, criticism and contempt are very similar concepts, but let me explain the difference just briefly. Criticism is when you say to your spouse, I don't like what you did. And contempt is, I don't like who you are. So let's say that it's the dishwasher, which a lot of couples fight about how to love the dishwasher. And you say, an example of criticism would be, you did it wrong. The forks go down, not up, right? Contempt would be same scenario, right? Felt like your spouse put the forks in wrong. And you say, you're so dumb for loading the dishwasher that way. I can't believe you would do that. It's ridiculous. It's contempt because it's personal. It's a personal attack instead of just an attack on what they did. And the research is pretty clear. Contempt destroys relationships. The Gottmans, who talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, talk about how contempt is again so linked to divorce that Dr. Gottman, Dr. John Gottman talks about how he can predict a divorce in a couple, like if they're going to get divorced with like 95% accuracy. And contempt is one of the main things he's looking for. If contempt is present, your relationship is much more likely to end than otherwise, right? So again, curiosity fights criticism. And if we avoid criticism, we avoid the much more destructive force of contempt. Okay, so that's part of why curiosity is so key. So again, like I said earlier, if you can be curious, you can be less reactive and less defensive, which enables you to then be more present in the relationship and love and care for your partner or spouse, how you know they need to be treated, how you know they need to be cared for. So curiosity makes us more emotionally attractive because it's really hard to be emotionally attractive or even physically attractive to someone who is really reactive, to someone who's constantly getting frustrated with you or angry with you, or who's becoming defensive and can't take ownership, right? And so being curious about why your person is doing what they're doing, what are their motives? What are the feelings that drove that behavior? What thoughts are they having going through their mind that kind of justifies why they did what they did? Now, the thing I want to emphasize with this is that both people have to do it, right? Because it's very common in abusive relationships for someone to be curious and the other one to take advantage of that and never take ownership themselves, right? So these things kind of balance each other out, right? Because if I'm curious and I'm not seeing curiosity or ownership or empathy in my spouse or partner, then something's off, right? It has to be a joint effort. Now, let me give you all one caveat before I wrap up. And I'll tell this to my couples a lot of times. These concepts that I covered are simple, but they're hard. And that's how relationships work. Relationships are simple, but they're hard. And I think that kind of comes from the fact that we're human and it's very easy for us to be reactive, right? So when I talk to you about a concept like curiosity, for instance, you might be thinking, oh, well, Spencer, that's easy, like I can be curious, right? But when you're in the moment and you find those reactions kind of coming up in you, you might have a much harder time than you think being able to slow yourself down and be curious. Ownership and empathy too, right? On the surface, the concept is very simple, but the application of it can be very, very difficult. Okay. So if you find yourself, being like super motivated right now, like, yeah, I'm going to do these things in my relationship, or me and my spouse or partner, we're going to do better in these things. And you set all these goals or make all these plans or set all these intentions to do better. And then a day in, you're like, holy cow, this is freaking hard. I just want to validate that experience for you, that it is going to be hard to implement some of these things. These are things that can take months and sometimes years to get good at. The key is, are you progressing? Are you continually putting in effort? And are you seeing some growth, even if that growth feels minimal? And then also, are you seeing that growth in your partner or spouse? And if you aren't, I would encourage you to have that conversation with them so you both can be more on the same page of what it's going to take your relationship to that next level. Again, these concepts of ownership, empathy, and curiosity are all about making the relationship better, improving emotional connection. And it's because if you have these principles or concepts in your life and you apply them in your relationship, you're going to be much more emotionally attractive to your significant other. So, thank you so much for spending the time with me today to learn about these concepts of relationships. And I sincerely hope that you're able to find success in applying them into your life. Again, thanks and have a good rest of your day, guys.